All right. Wow.
Hey, look at that. You made it. You
Wow.
did it.
Whoa. I'm like 3 seconds late. I can't believe it.
Well, where are you,
Calling
Rick?
calling Chris Andrews. I go first.
Oh,
I
okay,
know
sorry.
I know it's been a while since we've done it
Out
live,
of
but we have
practice.
to remember the form.
Okay.
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
I am, believe it or not. Look at I'm home. I'm home.
Yeah, wow, that's very exciting. You're
But I can tell
home.
that you're not. Where are you?
No, I am in Queechee, Vermont. So I
Oh,
did a show from here a year ago, and it's the same Dartmouth weekend. I'm here with a bunch of people.
You're doing that whole alumni thing.
We have multiple condos. There might be people coming in behind
So do you
me.
like wear silly hats and sing the Dartmouth fight song and do
No,
stuff like
so
that?
we do not. But we do play. We used to play touch football, and but we stopped that a couple of
Because
years
you're all too
ago.
old now.
Yes, and now we do bocce and croquet.
Oh, okay. That's very civilized.
Welcome, everyone, to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, offering a variety of history tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. And wow, what a week. Neither Chris or I is actually leading one of those tours. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast, thank you for joining us. Today we'll be talking about FDR advisor and confidant Anna Rosenberg, who the New York Times once called one of the most influential women in the country's public affairs for a quarter of a century. So let us know you're here. Let us know what you're drinking. Chris, you're in a good mood today.
I am because guess what? Everybody knows this already. Arsenal beat Man City by yes.
Okay.
That's
And
big
then,
news.
and what sport is this?
It's the beautiful game. It's football.
Football. Okay.
Yes.
Football. Very good.
And you're awfully chipper.
There was
there was what? No, go ahead.
No, please.
I heard that you've got something happened.
Yes.
Pending. Yeah. What's that?
So on Tuesday, the new edition of the Ghost Army of World War II comes out. So
There's going to be an updated author.
it's a new updated edition with a new additional chapter about stuff that we've learned since the first book came out 8 years ago. And yeah, very exciting. So I'm really looking forward to
Those
that.
candid shots of the author at home and modeling
No.
Army swag.
No, you just have to watch watch our show to see that.
Uh,
And by the way, as we're very slowly getting started here because we're trying to remember how to do this, we want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, and especially we want to thank our top shelf patrons and say all of our Patreon supporters help us keep the history tabs open, and
really appreciate it.
we do appreciate it. And you can join this group of very distinguished people by becoming a patron at patreon.com/historyhappyhour. So, Chris, I'm nervous that if we don't actually get to the show pretty soon, that we're going to lose the viewers are going to say, yeah, never mind.
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, or our guest might leave, so we should probably get started. So give me a cue and we'll get going.
All right. Oh, there you go. I knew you were gonna. Yeah, I thought.
Yeah. The bar is open.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. Look, Anna Rosenberg was a Hungarian immigrant who became one of FDR's closest advisors, and according to Life magazine, was the most important official female in the world. The bell keeps going off. She was an advisor to 5 presidents. She had a remarkable impact on 20th century America, from the New Deal to the Cold War. And today we're going to talk about her with Christopher Gorham, who has just written the first ever biography of Rosenberg, and it's called The Confidante, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America. And Christopher is a lawyer and teacher of modern history at Westford Academy outside of Boston, and we welcome him to History Happy Hour.
There you go.
Oh, look, he's got a cocktail.
He's right in. We like him already.
Did you bring a cocktail, Chris?
Thank
you.
Okay.
Cheers.
So, cheers to everybody.
And you, Rick. There we go.
I am the only person not named Christopher on this call, so I know my place, and I'll try to be careful of it. Christopher, read it. First of all, reading your book, I'm struck about what a force Anna Rosenberg was in the late 30s, the 40s, the 50s. She's a very high-powered figure. She's all over the news media. She's involved in a ton of important decisions, and we'll go into all that. But my question is, why has it taken 70 to 80 years for a biography of her to come out, and what made you want to do it?
That's a great question. She was a famous person, a famous figure in certainly, the New Yorker ran a profile on her in 1937 or 38. She was in the New York Times for 7 decades. She was on or in all the magazines in the 40s and 50s. There were academics were sort of sniffing around. They realized that she was pretty extraordinary, and there a few academics wrote up some really wonderful pieces on her. Presidential historian would write one. A business historian wrote one on her mediation, being a pioneer in mediation. A military historian wrote a very fine piece on her time at the Pentagon. But for some reason, it could be that she was more of a telephone person than leaving a ton of boxes of documents person. But for whatever reason, the different lily pads of academia didn't meet each other for the full narrative story. And I feel very grateful that I kind of landed, with her documents and felt like I could do that. I could stitch together these different aspects of her remarkable career in sort of a narrative way. And, I feel very grateful that I was around to do that. And, I lived close enough to Harvard to be able to access those documents regularly and consistently to be able to tell that story.
So, one of the things that strikes you right away is a little bit about her origin story. I mean, if she had just been a woman that accomplished the things that she did, that would be incredible. But she has just an incredible backstory before she even gets to the point where she can enter the stage, I guess you'd say. Could tell us a little bit about kind of where she came from and a little bit about her background before she, embarks on this career.
Anna Lederer was her birth name, and this young girl at age 12 winds up. Well, her father left Budapest, Hungary, because his business was ruined by the caprice of the emperor. His father left the country in 1910 and came to work in the needle trades of Manhattan. After 2 years, he was able to summon for her, and he called upon his family to join him in 1912. So she arrives as a 12-year-old girl, Anna Lederer, in New York, and her first 5 years in the United States, from the age of 12 to 17, she's in the New York public schools. She's struggling to learn English. She's really struggling to fit in terms of, she and her sister would wear like the Hungarian outfits and be teased, and she's trying to fit in. And there are two things that were going on at that time. And because her father had become such a fiercely patriotic American in his time in the United States and passed that on to his daughters, these things that were happening really struck her. One was the women's right to vote was in the air. It was in the water supply. And, I think there were certainly women that were marching for that in New York City, thought that was right over the horizon. And indeed, it wasn't far. And the other thing, of course, was the First World War that breaks out in 1914. And then, of course, the United States entering that war. So she had, even from as a teenager, she was eager to do whatever she could for her adopted country to make it the best. So that meant marching for women's suffrage. It meant selling Liberty bonds on the street corners of New York. And it meant volunteering as a Red Cross nurse during World War I.
And she... Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, but it's unusual to say a young Jewish immigrant to America who can't speak English. She's in, these immigrant neighborhoods. For her to kind of even break out of that and be able to is an achievement, right?
Of course. And one of the things that really struck me, and it was something that I latched upon very early in the research, was there had been a strike at the New York City boys' high schools were striking because they didn't want to go to the school day, finish the school day, and then go to compulsory military training, to be sent over to the trenches. Because, you can't play football, you can't work, you can't go to your job. You have your school day is like twice as long. So they chose her from a neighboring girls' school to be their mouthpiece. So even as, a 17-year-old girl, she had a reputation in New York City as someone who was, this Roman candle, this person that was extraordinary even as a teenager. And she, in fact, helped mediate that. She helped come to an agreement between the powers that be in New York City and the boys who were striking, and found herself in the New York Times for the first time at age 17. And of course, she was in the New York Times for the next 7 decades.
That's crazy.
So she doesn't go to college, which is another sort of fascinating thing about her. High school is as far as she goes, but she gets a great political education, kind of an on-the-job political education that stands her in good stead. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely, Rick. There were two people when she was after high school. Like you said, she didn't go to college. She got married, and she and her husband, Mike Rosenberg, had a son in 1920. But she met two people in her early 20s that were formative and transformative, really, for her. One was Belle Moskowitz, who was the sort of de facto chief of staff of the governor of New York, Al Smith. And Al Smith was powerful. He was considered potentially a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president. And this woman, Belle Moskowitz, is behind the throne, and she's drafting legislation and fundraising, and she's the gatekeeper. And she hired young Anna Rosenberg to do some work for her, and was just, I think, blown away at how talented and how hardworking and how smart this young woman was. And it didn't hurt that she spoke Hungarian and German and English. So Belle Moskowitz was the first person that showed Anna what it was like for a woman at that time to wield political power. It wasn't on the stage. It wasn't in the office. It was behind the curtain. And the other person that she met at that time was Jim Hagan, who was a Tammany Hall operator, very tough, bare-knuckled guy. And they didn't start off too well because she went to a meeting where he was railing against women's right to vote, and she sassed him. And instead of being angry, he called her up to the front after the meeting and wound up mentoring her for 3 years on the retail politics of New York, how to knock on thousands of doors, make thousands of phone calls, and get your issue acted upon and your candidate elected. So she did get a PhD in the politics of New York City from those two remarkable figures.
And the thing, though, that she kind of does to pay the bills, I guess you'd say, or she falls into is labor relations and mediation. So maybe talk a little bit about that. And the other, as I was reading more about this, I was curious, did she even invent the idea of mediation in this way? I mean, she ends up, it seems like a very new thing, and she's sort of eye deep in it. So how does that sort of side of her career get going?
Yeah, it goes back to Belle Moskowitz. Belle Moskowitz sent her a check for her work with Jewish philanthropies. Anna Rosenberg sent it back to Belle Moskowitz, thinking, she had done that for free. Belle Moskowitz sent the check back to Anna and said, if you don't value your own work, nobody else will. And moreover, young lady, why don't you think about, you're pretty good at this, so why don't you think about labor relations? And so Anna does open up a labor relations office. It was very modest at the beginning, and it would later grow. But if she wasn't a pioneer in mediation or the first person to sort of develop mediation, she was certainly a pioneer in it. Because at that time, as you guys know, you were on the side of management or you were on the side of the union. And, there were labor relations were very touchy for those decades. And along comes, Anna Rosenberg, and she had this sort of magic about her, which allowed her to maintain the trust and respect of not only management and owners of companies, but we're talking about people like the Rockefellers. I mean, right. She wound up having some pretty wonderful big clients, but also union guys would say, if Anna tells us something, we know she's on the level. So she was able to maintain the trust and have the ear of both management and the union. And she was a true mediator. And this is something that I think Roosevelt saw in her very early and was glad to have that skill on his team.
But I mean, I was struck as I was reading about her early career. This young woman in 1920s, 1930s America is sitting down with dock workers and the Rockefellers saying, "Okay, fellas, let's all sort this out." It just seems so improbable that, if you saw it in a movie, you'd be like, "This is crazy."
She, and I've had, I think, about 60, 65 events around the country and on Zoom for this book. And the thing that just continues to amaze me as I talk to audiences about her is just what you said, Chris. I mean, she had this extraordinary superpower to have the respect of both men and women, both rich and modest, white and black. I mean, it was just, we think about our fractured times. I mean, it's so rare today. But what she was able to do was really, that's sort of the extraordinary story. That's the core of her. She was liked and respected by just about everyone she came into contact with.
And I mean, and we'll move on from this in a moment, but I just shared this, that even at this early stage in her career, when she's 30, 31, 32, the fact that she didn't go to college, she was not a lawyer, she didn't come from a well-to-do family, she's a poor Jewish immigrant, and she's just doing all this based on her intelligence, her personality, and her sort of her character, because I mean, I think she was just a real square dealer, and that really reflected with people. And she just must, I mean, I want to meet this 30-year-old Anna Rosenberg and sort of try to understand what the secret sauce is.
One of the secret, sort of the secret magic about her, one of the clues was from her grandson, Thomas, who I interviewed for the book. And he knew her as his grandmother. She wasn't one to pass on the war stories and to dwell on the past. So, but he talked about, just when she was talking to you, you were the only person in existence. You were the only person in the world. And I think, she was talking to Nelson and David Rockefeller like that, but she was also talking to union leaders and rank and file men and women like that. And they just thought, wow, this person really believes in me and is listening to me and is taking what I say seriously. And now that's just good practice for all of us. But she really had it down to an art form.
Yeah. So I think, obviously, kind of a central part of the book is her relationship with FDR and being with him early on. Since it's such a life-altering thing, is there a moment when they meet? What's that moment? How does she become involved with FDR? And
well, it's 1928. She's still in New York, and she was a young mother, a young wife. And she said later that she was dabbling in politics. It was always more than that. She was always interested in going out and finding out what was going on in the neighborhood in terms of what she could do to get the issues that she wanted acted upon. But in 1928, she went to a tea hosted by Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt meets her and says, "Young lady, what do you do for a living?" Anna says, "Well, I'm labor relations. I do mediation." And Eleanor Roosevelt says, "Well, my husband is running for governor of New York, and he could use someone like you on his team." So at that young age, she found herself on the sprint of Roosevelt's gubernatorial team with people like Jim Farley and Francis Perkins and Louis Howe. And that was the beginning of what was obviously the most important relationship that she would ever make in her life, the relationship with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt.
And so, to what degree, this is a complicated question, but, the fact that she's a woman, does that help her with FDR? Does it hurt? I mean, is it create a special relationship that's different than some of the other relationships?
We talked about this yesterday. I was at the library here in Mashpee on Cape Cod, and she could be flirtatious. She had an allure over men that she was aware of, and she was not afraid or to use it or embarrassed to use it. And at the same time, she also, when the situation called for it, could be tough as a $2 steak. So again, here's some of the magic of this extraordinary person. She could be soft and hard. She could be alluring on the one hand, but also very tough if the situation demanded it. Now, as it pertains to Roosevelt, she said very frankly that I think she said it to Joseph Lash, but she said very candidly, Roosevelt liked, she said, quote, good-looking women. He was a flirt. And she was cognizant of that when she was meeting with him one-on-one. And I will take this opportunity to tell a little story. Roosevelt, as you may know, would whip up a batch of cocktails, and they were very often martinis. And they would be, he would be meeting one-on-one with Anna Rosenberg at the White House, and he would make up a batch of martinis, and he would pour her one and pour himself one. and then Anna would pour hers out in the rubber plant that sat next to her chair. And Eleanor Roosevelt later scolded her for this. She said, "Anna, you're killing my rubber plant by pouring my tea. Please stop doing that." But she knew that that the president liked the company of attractive women, and that certainly didn't hurt her ability to have access to the president.
So in the years before World War II, what is she doing with or for Roosevelt? Is she actually in the White House, or is she kind of like an unpaid advisor in New York, or what's her role?
Well, before World War II, during the New Deal, Roosevelt had been elected president in 1932, and as he's scaling up, what he had tested in New York State, he scales it up for the nation. It becomes the New Deal. He remembers, Anna Rosenberg, this young woman who I met on the gubernatorial campaign. So he makes her the only woman executive of not one but two New Deal programs. The first one was the National Industrial Recovery Act, and of course, like you said earlier, she didn't go to college. She did not, never cracked open a law book. But she finds herself with, hundreds of lawyers and field offices across the Empire State. And that particular New Deal agency was bedeviled. I mean, you're never going to get companies to play nice and not compete in an effort to raise wages. And in fact, the Supreme Court put an end to that program altogether in 1935 with the sick chicken case. And then she meets Roosevelt one-on-one for the first time in 1936. She does not have an office in the White House yet. She's still just based in New York. But they meet one-on-one at the White House, and then he makes her the chief executive of the Social Security program in New York State. And this is incredible. And this is a perfect fit for her because the empathy, the smarts, the hardworking, the everything. And she winds up signing up 6 million New Yorkers to Social Security. And she has, elderly women saying to her, "I can't tell you my real age because my husband doesn't know my real age." And she says, "Uncle Sam and I will keep your secrets." But she had tremendous pride at Social Security. She said it was dynamic. It was democracy. It was dynamic. It was changing in real time for her. And she was such a big part of that. She was very, very proud to be part of the New Deal and to be changing and transforming American lives in the millions.
One of the things I was interested in, seeing as I live here in the UK and I'm an expat, I was really interested in the story of her coming here as part of her New Deal duties, coming here to Britain as part of a delegation. So could you tell us why she came, what that was all about, and if that had any impact on kind of her or her standing in the administration?
President Roosevelt was, obviously he was a stamp collector. He was interested in part of his interest in stamps was how other countries deal with problems. And he was interested in finding out how, countries like Great Britain and Sweden were dealing with some of their labor issues. So he sent a delegation over there in it was 1936. And Francis Perkins was one of the people on the delegation, and there were other business leaders and their wives. And Anna Rosenberg found herself a part of that delegation.
They didn't want her there, right?
I'm sorry?
Most of the people in the delegation didn't even want her as part of it.
Right. The titans of industry and their wives were staying at, they stayed at their own hotels and didn't really interact with Anna Rosenberg. But she was, and of course, Secretary Perkins was, she wasn't really interacting with the delegation either. But it was when she returned from this fact-finding mission that we learn a lot about Anna Rosenberg and Franklin Roosevelt, because she was invited up to Hyde Park upon returning from this delegation over to Europe. And she said that the president was uninterested or didn't like to wait for the full formal report. He wanted to know from his people, rather informally, if they could, what did you find out? What happened? He didn't need the full official report. So that's what she said. But she told him up in Hyde Park during a kind of a fun day where they were barbecuing and going out to a baseball game. She told him what the commission had found and some of the findings. And, he responded well to that and trusted her for that. But of course, Secretary Perkins, the steam was coming out of her ears because the official report hadn't even been prepared yet for the president's eyes.
So it's kind of interesting, and we should take a minute to talk about Frances Perkins here. She was the Secretary of Labor for Franklin Roosevelt for 12 years, I think, for his whole presidency. I think she's the only cabinet member who served the whole presidency. She was was she the first woman in the cabinet? I think she was. And so here comes Anna Rosenberg, and some people refer to her as like a second Frances Perkins or the next, Frances Perkins. And she's kind of like her in some ways, not like her in some ways. And you might think that Frances Perkins would mentor her or appreciate this person, but they do not have a very positive relationship, do they?
No. And I really blame Franklin Roosevelt for this. And because
and he feels the lash of your anger. I can tell you.
One of the things that he would do as president is put people on parallel tracks. He would say, there's the goal line, there's the problem I want you to fix. But he would put two teams on it or two people on it. And so Anna Rosenberg finds herself, both in the New Deal and then, of course, in World War II, doing things for the president that really would fall under the umbrella of the Secretary of Labor. And you're completely right. The newspapers would call her de facto Secretary of Labor or Frances Perkins #2, which, of course, would infuriate Frances Perkins. How dare this young woman do this? But it was really Roosevelt that was setting her up to compete with Secretary Perkins. And the other thing, you said they were very different people, and they certainly were. Frances Perkins had Penn and Columbia, sort of behind her and said, tomato and theater. And of course, Anna Rosenberg has the Hungarian Bronx accent and, hasn't a college
Thank
education.
you, darling. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Darling, like Zsa Zsa Gabor. So very, very different personalities. And, poor Frances Perkins, whose wish list became the New Deal, and we should all venerate her, if we believe in the New Deal and what it did for America. But she could not handle she did not handle the fishbowl of Washington very well. Even Eleanor Roosevelt said that. This is not talking outside of school. Frances Perkins was ill-equipped to handle the fishbowl of Washington, whereas Anna Rosenberg was a PR person. I mean, she loved it. She was very, very adept at that and at ease with that. So. They had a rocky, at times a rocky relationship, and one that Frances Perkins, did not look always kindly upon this young interloper. But Anna Rosenberg saw, she was always respectful to Secretary Perkins and always saw her job as doing what the president wanted to the best of her ability.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was helpful and illuminating in the book was you talked not only about obviously her in these positions and what's happening to her, but also the impact that she's having on Roosevelt. I mean, you say in her way, Anna played a role in FDR's evolution to a more practical politician. So, I mean, she is important. She's not just a PR person. She is a major player, and that obviously goes throughout the book. But could you tell us what you mean by that? What is she doing to Roosevelt to make him a better leader, a better president?
He had, for instance, as a young politician in Albany, he had battles with Tammany Hall and didn't really see eye to eye with those folks. And, Anna came up, you think about Jim Hagan at Tammany, he kind of came up, and Fiorello LaGuardia too. He was another person that had early connections with Tammany Hall. She was able to kind of show him or ways in which problems could be solved in a more practical way. One example would be when he was running for governor. And what did Anna do on that team was to gently say to the rest of the people on the team, if we're going to talk about minimum wage, let's talk about passing a minimum wage for women, because she knew as a woman that the backlash against that was going to be less. It was going to be diluted. Because people, if it were minimum wage for men, the people that don't want a minimum wage at all are going to be teeing off on that. But if it's minimum wage for women, the fairer sex, it's going to dilute the backlash a little bit. So that was one instance where, Anna was able to say, here's something that we can do a little more pragmatically, and here's my idea. And in fact, the labor plank during that gubernatorial race turned out to be a winner for Franklin Roosevelt.
So when does Anna Rosenberg find herself in Roosevelt's inner circle? So she's come up. She's had these New Deal posts in the NRA and in Social Security, and she's clearly, after that meeting in 1936, she's clearly becoming closer and closer. But when does she really find herself in the close inner circle?
It starts in the summer of 1941, Rick, with a real problem that Roosevelt found himself in, and that was the defense industries. This is 6 months before Pearl Harbor, but the defense industries had been hiring tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers. These were good paying jobs. They were only going to white Americans. And the black leader of the day, A. Philip Randolph, said, I'm going to march on the White House for equality. And even Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady, was sympathetic with this. But Franklin Roosevelt, knowing that he had Southern lawmakers he had to deal with, this was a real bind for him. So he, went back to Anna Rosenberg, who was an ace mediator, and said, I need you to mediate a solution that makes the black leadership happy and the White House happy. And over 2 weeks in the summer of 1941, she, as I argue in the book, was the chief drafter of Executive Order 8802, which mandated fairness in defense hiring, and one of the first federal actions on civil rights since Reconstruction. And that was really the beginning of, by 1942, Roosevelt in the newspapers is calling her my Mrs. Fix-It. She has an office in the East Wing. And, this is also coinciding with Tommy Corcoran being pushed out of the Roosevelt inner circle, Missy LeHand having illnesses and grave illnesses, which is going to push her out of the inner circle. So partially it was luck to find herself, find an opening at the round table. And part of it was just he, really responded to her problem solving ability. And so I would say 41, 42, she is in the innermost circle, and she stayed there for the duration of his presidency.
Can I have a follow-up, Chris? Yeah, on 8802, the executive order that creates the FEPC. So you used a phrase when you were answering that question. You said, "as I argue," and so as I was reading this, and you do make this argument, but I was wondering, are you the first to suggest that she had a major role in this, or
no?
Does everybody believe she had a major role, or is there some argument about it?
I think there is an argument about it. The first person that gave her credit for this is Doris Kearns. So Doris Kearns in No Ordinary Time, says, look, this is interesting. This woman was in every meeting for 2 weeks, both in New York City and Washington, including the Oval Office. And now she was the only person that was in every single meeting. But I think what I added to that was, she was a pioneer in mediation. She was a demonstrably successful mediator. And the argument part is there was, I think, a White House lawyer who was much younger than Anna Rosenberg, who I can spell his name maybe. I'm not sure I pronounce it, Rauh maybe, who in other books I've seen had taken credit for putting that together. So it is an argument that I'm making based on the fact that Roosevelt wanted her, insisted that she be at every single meeting, that she was a mediator, that the executive order itself bears the economy of words that she could be known for, and also the watchdog provision, which she was well aware of. This was something that needed to be in that, or it was not going to work. And she knew about those from her time as a National Industrial Recovery Administration in New York. So I'm speculating, but I'm putting all those together and making the claim that I think she was the chief drafter. And in fact, if you believe what Eleanor Roosevelt said, she was the one that took the draft out of her purse and spread it on the president's desk and said, "Sign it, Mr. President, sign it." And he listened.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty dramatic moment in the book when she just kind of lays it on his desk and kind of gives him an order.
Right.
Yeah. We had a question from one of our viewers, Wally, and that kind of leads into where I want to go next, and that's the war. And because Wally wanted to know about her influence on foreign policy and foreign affairs, because of course, looming large over all of this is the war, which is about to happen. Right. So we can touch on Wally's question, but I also wanted to kind of tack on to that. As you were going through the research and looking at her did she write or say, or what do you know? Was she aware of sort of the international situation, what's happening in the world, and that threat, or is she just so focused on whatever Mr. President says to do?
Well, I think there are two things that she did things for President Roosevelt during the war on the home front, and she did things for President Roosevelt literally in the battlefields, in the battles of Europe. Was she aware of what was happening with Jews in Europe? The answer is almost certainly it would have to be yes. I mean, Mayor LaGuardia and Anna Rosenberg drove to work together in the mayor's limousine for years, and even at this time. And Mayor LaGuardia's sister was back in Hungary with her husband, and she was picked up by the Gestapo or the SS. She was sent to Ravensbrück, and her husband was murdered by an SS guard. So, Anna Rosenberg would have clearly known this story and known furthermore about what was going on in Europe as it pertained to the Jews under Nazi occupation. We don't have the records of what was said in the nearly 150 one-on-one meetings between Anna Rosenberg and Franklin Roosevelt. But one interesting thing that came up around this question is when Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, who was Jewish and a friend of Roosevelt, and one of his key advisors, Henry Morgenthau in January of 1944, according to his biographer, put his foot down with the president and said, we need to do something for Jewish refugees in Europe. And 2 days later, Roosevelt meets with Anna Rosenberg one-on-one. The next day, Roosevelt meets with Anna Rosenberg again one-on-one. And a couple of days after that, he signs executive order that established the War Refugee Board. Now, that's speculative. I get it. But it also might indicate that decision-making was in the air. And maybe he sounded out Anna Rosenberg on her opinions about what to do. And of course, she would have presumably said, yes, this is a good idea. Maybe it's too little too late, but let's do this.
I mean, just the fact that you were saying in your answer that she has 141.
Yeah, that's unbelievable.
Private meetings with Roosevelt. That's, that's significant.
It really is. And, you think about, poor Francis Perkins and other cabinet members trying to get that access. And he, I discuss it in the book, but she was a good listener. He loved to be the raconteur. She could also tell her own stories that entertained him. He needed time to de-stress, and she was, she would smuggle in chicken paprika and she'd pour her martini out and wave that unlit cigarette, and they'd be able to de-stress a little bit. So he found her an important person during World War II.
I want to remind everybody we're talking to Christopher Gorham, who is the author of the book, The Confidante, The Untold Story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America. And, of course, that's Anna Rosenberg. So the war happens, and there's a lot of stuff that happens in the war. Maybe we can unpack a little bit of it. But one of the things that happens is that, there's a whole effort to organize industry in America, and it kind of fumbles along for the first 6 months, and things are not really getting priorities and such are not really getting organized so that we can manufacture everything we're going to need to manufacture for this war effort. And Anna Rosenberg gets involved in this and comes up with something called the Buffalo Plan, which is a great name, and it involves the city of Buffalo. But tell us a little bit about that and what her role in that is.
So this is, like you said, 6 months or so after Executive Order 8802. It's 1942-43. I think there's a tendency to think of the arsenal of democracy as like this light switch that America flipped on. And we flipped it on, and Chrysler was building tanks, and Ford was building planes, and all the ordnance and the belt buckles and helmets were being built for the Allies and also for the U.S. Armed Forces. That's partially true, but it's more complicated because the labor situation was dire. And that's a word that Eleanor Roosevelt used in the newspapers, 42, 43, mid-war. There was piracy from certain industries to other defense industries. An example would be the aircraft industries found it a lot easier to get guys that were on the steel mills or in the tank factories because they were they were well lit. There was women working there. They were not as dirty and stinky and yucky to work in. There was absenteeism. There was alcoholism. There were women that would have joined up the war effort, but for lack of child care and other logistical things that they needed. The most hardest hit place, or one of the most hardest hit places, was the Buffalo region, Buffalo Niagara region, which built everything. They were building planes, parachutes, medicine. It was for the Allies. It was planes for the Russians, planes for the Brits, planes for us. And they were short almost 100,000 workers. And, these contracts were imperiled. And if you think about it, then that's going to imperil lives overseas, in the battle zones. And Roosevelt, by this time, is calling Anna Rosenberg his Mrs. Fix-It. So he says to Mrs. Fix-It, go to Buffalo. You're the labor czar. Fix it. And she immediately starts hiring more women because she knows to do the logistical stuff. She has childcare set up for them. She has places to cash their check at 3 a.m. that's safe after they finish their shift. She has all the city parks lit and heated overnight. She has all the movie theaters running 24/7 and on and on and on. And she gets single women, women with children, married women. She gets grandmothers. And then the leaders of Buffalo aren't going to hire blacks. So she says to them, this is no time for disunity. This is no time to show our caste system. Let's all hands on deck. And they listened to her. Americans with disabilities, even high schoolers pitched in. She got those almost 100,000 workers. Those contracts were fulfilled. And this was a program that was rolled out nationwide for the duration of the war. And fellas, if you'll indulge me, I'll read just a little bit how the Rosenberg or the Buffalo Plan worked. The Liberty ships, these big, huge cargo ships that crossed the Atlantic, the first one took 131 days to build. By the time the surplus New Yorker workers were sent to Portland, Oregon, where they were needed, by the time Anna Rosenberg had that done, things changed. First Liberty ship took 131 days. When the New Yorkers were on the docks, this is what happened. The keel of the Robert E. Peary was laid on a Sunday. It was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. There was a woman there to christen the ship. She was late. A dock worker said, just keep standing there, ma'am. There'll be another one along in a minute. That was the Buffalo Plan.
So it's her system then that is used nationwide or in several parts of the nation to actually mobilize labor.
Yes.
Right. So there's no arsenal of democracy without the Buffalo Plan.
Yes, and that is, I'm trying to think of, I don't know if it's David Kennedy or some of the other, the sort of big, thick history books on Roosevelt and war. She gets her due, not only contemporaneously in the newspapers and magazines of 1942, 43, but she does get her due in certain histories by some of our better historians for the Buffalo Plan. That's something that she does get credit for in some of these very well-regarded books.
There's a great story in your book about, and I think it's not Buffalo, but I think it's, she's working to get workers out to the West Coast to work with Henry J. Kaiser, and the union leader won't permit blacks to be in the union. And she just says, stop, I'm not sending any more workers until we figure this out. And 2 days later, he relents and says, okay, blacks can join the union. And then she says, okay, well, then the workers can keep on coming.
That's a great moment, Rick. That was great to read. I found a newspaper clipping, that talked about this union guy, Tom Ray, who'd been summoned to a meeting with, this government official, Anna Rosenberg. And, he thought, who's going to stop me? I'm this tough union guy. But boy, he found out, she was peeling the paint off the walls in that meeting, but he relented. And that was what was reported in this newspaper clipping, that he stood down. And Anna got those trains running back again and getting those workers where they were needed. And the black workers were given the jobs that they thought they were going to get when they were signing up for this.
But I think the other thing that was very moving that she accomplishes all these things, but then, being Mrs. Fix-It, she gets sent to Europe and she sees what it's like on the sharp end. And you write pretty movingly about those visits to Western Europe during the war and what impact that had on her. And maybe you could explain a little bit to our viewers, like what she saw and what that meant.
This is just an extraordinary thing, Chris. Roosevelt, when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, had been sent by President Wilson to the trenches of World War I. And now it's his turn to send somebody to find out how these soldiers were faring and what they dreamed of when they came back. And he chooses Anna Rosenberg. It's just this incredible thing. So she goes over there for 6 weeks, in just a few weeks after D-Day. And, her mission was to find out from the GIs what they wanted if they were lucky enough to return. And she found out in 6 weeks of, these were not formal interviews, but in 6 weeks of traveling with the army that was liberating villages and cities and towns across France, these guys wanted a college education. And she took copious notes about this from these conversations. And after 6 weeks, she goes back to the White House, and Roosevelt says, what do they want? Mr. President, they want an education. They want a college education. And she said he lit up. Of course they wanted a new job. Of course they wanted to have dancing lessons. But more importantly is they wanted a piece of the America they were trying to help save. This was the generation of depression and war. College education was only for wealthy young men until this moment. Now, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, if you look at the provisions 45, 46, 47, all educational in nature, and it became transformative. It was imperfect, but transformed America by elevating millions of people in the middle class.
And that's in part, not totally, but in part that's based on her impressions of actually getting out and getting dirty and talking to these guys.
That's exactly right. They would say to her, like, she would be having rations with them on the hood of a Jeep, or they'd be pulling their picture their sweetheart out of their helmet. And what do you fellas want when you get back? And time again, it was, we want to better ourselves through college education. And it became one of the ammunition for President Roosevelt and his people to make sure that those items were grafted onto that huge piece of legislation to make that a reality when they got back. And they did.
Then she goes back for a second trip to Europe. Roosevelt asks her to go on, and then Truman has her go on, where she visits the Nordhausen death camp. And you paint a very moving picture of that.
It was the last lunch that President Roosevelt ever ate in the White House was a one-on-one with Anna Rosenberg, where he ordered her back over to Europe to follow up with her work with the GIs that were now closer to demobilization. That was her mission. Before she left for Europe, President Roosevelt died. So she was actually at the White House on April 12th. That happened. She found it very difficult to refer to Harry Truman, whom she liked, but she found it very difficult at first to even refer to him as Mr. President. She had been knowing Roosevelt for so long, it was difficult. But Truman sent her on the mission. He said, if the boss wanted you to go on this, I want you to go on it too. So she goes to Europe in April and early May 1945, just as the Nazi state is imploding. And her mission to follow up with the demobilization gets sidetracked a little bit because General Eisenhower had liberated the first of the concentration camps and immediately cabled Washington and said, I need journalists, I want Congress people, I want people to bear witness to these atrocities. Well, Anna Rosenberg was already in Europe. So they flew her to Nordhausen. She arrived so soon after liberation that the prisoners were still wearing the uniforms. And I only found that she spoke about this one time, but and very profoundly, she said, these women approached me, they could barely stand erect. I was carrying a man's briefcase and a woman's purse. And I thought, I don't have any food. I don't have any clothing. What can I give them? She reached in and, gave a lipstick to one, a compact to another, notepaper to a third, and pencils. And she recognized the insufficiency of this gesture, but also the look on the faces of these women. Something had been given back to them, however small. A little piece of humanity had been returned to them after everything had been taken from them. Very, very profound.
Mm.
So, we've only gotten about halfway through the book here. This one was not done yet. So she comes back. She's now involved with Truman. I should add that you have some very interesting things in the book about what she knew about the Manhattan Project, her involvement in that. So people should buy the book and read about that. But so the war's over and she can relax now, right? And she's done her bit for the country. She's done.
It's 5 years after the end of World War II. It's 1950. She has returned to New York. She has rebuilt or is rebuilding her business. Her son, who had been in World War II, is back helping her rebuild her business. She's back with her husband. She finally bought the apartment that she'd rented for decades. Things are pretty good. in the fall of 1950. And then she opens up a letter from General Marshall, the Secretary of Defense.
But you should say a personal letter, right?
A personal letter,
a handwritten letter.
handwritten letter, which is yes. And it says, it starts off, "Dear Anna, I hope you can see your way back to Washington." And what he wanted from her was to help him rebuild the size and strength of the U.S. Army that had been decimated by budget cuts following World War II. We were trying to occupy Japan and Germany, hem the Soviets in Eastern Europe, and now we had this disastrous war in Korea. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, the general could have asked anybody, any admiral, any general, any titan of industry, but he wanted Anna Rosenberg because of two things. She had what they used to call manpower, but we call personnel. She had the chops, with large groups, large organizations. But also importantly, is she could go up on Capitol Hill, which is something that she'd done for Roosevelt and for Truman, and lobby. So if you want to increase the size and scope of the American Army, one thing you need to do is go up and lobby Congress for more money. And she was willing to do that, and she was the right person, according to the general, for this job. And the problem was, of course, is as she said to the general, "I wear the bullseye. I'm Jewish. I'm an immigrant. I'm a woman. I'm a New Dealer. I'm a civilian. They're going to come after me, General. And they're going to come after you."
And they did.
I was going to say, and so she's appointed, and she immediately gets Senate approval, and there's no problem, right?
The Senate Armed Service
Not
Committee
exactly.
unanimously approved her, and she started her interim appointment. She opened that big, heavy door at the Pentagon and started those legendarily long days and nights with her and her staff working hard. All that was needed, Rick, was the full Senate confirmation, which was just seen as a formality. But Fulton Lewis, a radio star of the day with 10 million listeners, got wind of this, and he went to the airwaves and said, he denigrated her as nothing more than a social worker, and certainly brought up her name, Rosenberg, insinuating that she was disloyal to the country, maybe a communist. And Fulton Lewis made common cause with Senator Joe McCarthy, who used some of his connections in the Senate to postpone the full Senate confirmation for 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, those two men put together a smear campaign to try and paint Anna Rosenberg as a secret communist who had been disloyal to her country. And the linchpin of this whole smear campaign was a guy from New York City named Ralph DeSola. They got him to testify. He was going to take the train down to Washington and testify to the Senate Armed Service Committee that he had seen Anna Rosenberg at a communist cell meeting in the 1930s. And so over 2 weeks and 10 days in December of 1950, this rivets Washington and rivets the nation when Ralph DeSola comes face to face with Anna Rosenberg.
Yeah, and he testifies, and then she wants to have Adam, right?
Yeah.
Which is sort of uncharacteristic of her, right?
He had testified before senators like Lyndon Johnson, and they all knew he was full of it. And, his ex-wife was called, and they said, "What can you tell us about your husband?" She said, "I can't tell you on the record, but I'll tell you off the record. He has a very hard time telling the truth." So his story just blew up. It unraveled. The senators were going to send him back on the train to New York, and Anna said, no. I want this guy. I want to see him face to face. So, he came back into the chamber, and he looked her up and down and said, she said, "Am I the person that you saw at this communist cell meeting?" And he lied through his teeth and said, "Yes, you are." And boy, she was infuriated.
Yeah.
But she ends up, and this is where the story seems different than what might happen today. She ends up being approved on a basically unanimous vote, unanimous voice vote in the Senate. So both parties kind of come together and reject the lies and the bullshit about her, and so it works out. So how long is she with the Defense Department there, and what's the highlight of that? She makes a trip to Korea as part of that, doesn't she?
She was there for 26 months, and she made 2 trips to Korea. And again, she wasn't there as a VIP, having the guys stand at attention. She was there kneeling in the dirt with these guys, men and women. For the GIs themselves, she reduced the number of points they needed to come home. So virtually no soldiers spent 2 winters in Korea. For service women, not only were there more service women, but they were not just typewriter soldiers. They were in communication, they were in intelligence, they were in more important aspects of the armed services. And more important maybe even than those two things, she finally desegregated not only the foot dragging that the branches had engaged in, but the schools on southern bases, which had been segregated in the South. This is before Brown versus Board of Education. But these black soldiers, if they were from southern bases, they'd be, risking their lives for their country, and their daughter could not go to an integrated school. They had to be bused off site, off base, to a segregated school. And she put an end to that with the Office of Education. By 1953, the schools on Army bases were fully integrated before the Public Schools of America in 1954.
So, Christopher, I know Rick is going to say we're coming to the end of our show. So,
but I'm going to give you a chance to ask a question first.
Profound things, yes. So, I mean, I don't want to say an incredible woman. I mean, she's just an incredible American, right? She accomplished some amazing things. What's her legacy? What should we? How should she be remembered?
I think her, as I was researching and writing this book, guys, you know that we were going through quite a stretch of American history, and that was not lost on me, and there were so many echoes of McCarthyism in the 1950s with what was happening, at the time I was researching and writing, and I was just struck every day as I sat down to do my work that a citizen, she was a remarkable citizen, but she was, one citizen can make a change in this country and help make our country the greatest country it can be. If we work hard enough, if we're informed enough, if we have open heart, open mind, maybe that sounds a little wishy-washy, but we need more people. We all need to be more like her, and we need more people like her to maybe right the ship. But an extraordinary citizen, a remarkable citizen, and one that helped America be victorious in war and prosperous in peace.
Well, and we didn't even get into her relationship with Eisenhower, with JFK, with LBJ, and there's a great photo, which I'll just tease to make people buy your book, of her and LBJ. And so I'm sure there's all sorts of stories there that people should buy the book and take a look at. And the book, in case you need a reminder, is called The Confidante, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America. And Christopher Gorham, thank you so much for joining us today. Great conversation.
Rick and Chris, thank you very much, and thank you all for listening.
And you got to finish that cocktail. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Well, Chris, that was great to be back live. Great to do that interview. And next week on History Happy Hour, another Anna. We have another Anna. Yeah. So next week, we're going to be talking about Chinese-American movie star Anna May Wong. This is a little bit of a departure for us.
Cool.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking to Yunte Huang, who's the author of the new and highly praised book, Daughter of the Dragon, Anna May Wong's Rendezvous with American History. So I'm really looking forward to that and checking that out.
It's fascinating, and if you're really into the golden age of cinema and that whole time period, it's a really great book.
Yeah, so really, really looking forward to reading it and looking forward to talking about it. Don't forget the new Ghost Darby book out next Tuesday.
Absolutely not. And don't forget to share on Arsenal. Sorry.
Arsenal, they're number one right now. Arsenal is number one, so we appreciate that. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, listen to our podcast. We'll be editing that one out in the taped version. Back us on Patreon and browse us at historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.